Hello, so welcome to our 10th anniversary panel during Community Day at EclipseCon. It is my great pleasure to have, well, a very impressive lineup of panelists there, and we'll try to evoke good memories about the start of Eclipse IoT, discuss about the state of the industry, and look forward to the future as well. So let's start with introductions because, well, not everyone in the call was necessarily around where you guys were involved in Eclipse IoT. Let's start with the introduction. So in alphabetical order there. So let's start with you, Marco. So who are you and what were you doing when Eclipse IoT was launched?
Hi, Frédéric. So, well, thanks first of all to everybody that put together this event. It's a pleasure to be here today. Certainly good memories coming back. For me, it was incredible. It was my first week in Eurotech, actually. And then back then, Arlen Nipper, who was also one of the visionary that helped to put this together, invited over. We got into a plane and we flew to IBM Horsley in UK. And we met a lot of the people that we are in the call here. It was a great workshop. There were a lot of excitement, a lot of energy into the room to try to actually break what was back then a silos approach, a very vertical and very limited and focused way of solving problems. So back then, 10 years ago, my first week into the job, it was a great way to start. And I have to say this has been with me for the next 10 years, right? I'm now CTO of Eurotech, open source and IoT are at the core of what we do every day. So it was there at the beginning and it has been with us ever since.
Fantastic. Next would be Benjamin.
Hey, so yeah, I'm Benjamin Cabet, and back in 2011 or I guess 2010, and even before, I was working at Sierra Wireless, and I've been evolving in open source communities pretty much forever. And Eclipse, including Eclipse, I was a committer and super passionate about the Eclipse ecosystem. And at Sierra, we were building tools for machine to machine, and it felt wrong. Like my day-to-day job was building a tool that I felt was essentially just reinventing the wheel. Like it was pretty much like very early in the days of machine to machine, but still I was pretty convinced that the tools that we were putting together, this wasn't really where the value add for Sierra would be, right? Sierra Wireless was and is still selling cellular modems and silicon, right? And so that's how it started. Essentially, for me back then was to realize that it would probably make sense to join forces with others and to start working on open source tools, open source frameworks, so that we could again not reinvent the wheel and work higher up the value chain.
All right, thank you, Benjamin. Next would be Andy Piper.
Hello, everybody. Projecting myself back 10 years. So I was actually coming at that time to the end of my time at IBM. I remember the meeting that Marco was referencing where we all got together in Horsley, and that was, I think, the beginning of my last month at IBM, because I really wanted to see the MQTT technology released and open sourced by IBM as I was departing, which was very exciting. So I spent about 10 years working on messaging and integration technologies at IBM. As part of that, I got to know my good friend, Dr. Andy Stanford-Clark, who we'll hear from in a moment, and his technology, the lightweight messaging technology, MQTT in particular. So I became a bit of an evangelist for that. We're going to EclipseCon a few times, really engaging with the community, starting to work with folks like Ayan and Benjamin to build community around some of the technology. And then as we sort of brought all of the pieces together with the different projects that we were starting to think about in the context of Eclipse and the working group, that was actually as I was just moving on to new things. But I've remained involved, I've remained interested. I was sitting yesterday afternoon on a Sunday compiling the brand new Eclipse AMLN MQTT server for fun. So yeah, I'm very excited about where things have come since 2011.
Fantastic. Next would be Ayan.
Yes, thanks, Frédéric. I'm Ian Scarrett. I guess I used to be at the Eclipse Foundation. I used to be kind of helping with Benjamin lead the Eclipse IoT working group. We started the Eclipse IoT. It was actually the Eclipse M2M working group when we first started it, because IoT wasn't actually a thing yet. So kind of in retrospective, I think we were kind of ahead of a lot of other people in the space. But we started this. It's actually two companies independently came to us. Sierra Wireless, where Benjamin was working, and IBM with the MQTT story came to us and said, we want to do open source around M2M. And so this was an opportunity for us to actually get a kind of a community collaboration going, which we called a working group. And the IoT was, I believe, our first working group to the Eclipse Foundation. So there's two firsts here, right? And I guess kind of the success is certainly kind of a testament to it. We've been here for 10 years and it continues to thrive. I've actually moved out of the Eclipse Foundation. I'm now at HiveMQ, and I can see the benefit of open source and open standards from a commercial perspective. And I think it's kind of really telling how far the MQTT protocol has come. And it's the credit as absolutely due to the Eclipse Foundation, the Eclipse IoT working group.
Fantastic. And last but not least is our author, Andy.
That must be me by a process of elimination. Hello, everybody. Andy Stanford-Clark. I'm the CTO for IBM UK. As many of you will know, I'm the co-inventor with Arlen Nipper of MQTT many years ago, 22 years ago now. And we were getting to the stage in the evolution of the Internet of Things where we needed a place to bring together all the components that were forming. Everybody said everything I was going to say, so I'll just add that we envision this stack from almost from just above the hardware to the top of the application stack, where people will be designing frameworks for applications to run on classes of device. So it wasn't so much custom code on specific devices, but applications on platforms which were generic enough that you could then decide late in the day which piece of hardware to deploy that code to. And the original vision for the IoT working group in Eclipse was to be a place for that stack to be assembled. And I think we've done a pretty good job of it. If I look across all the projects that are in Eclipse IoT now, it's quite a staggering array. And as Andy P just mentioned, the Amlin Broker is the latest horse into the stable. And I suspect many more things to come as well. But fantastic to be here, and just tremendous that we've got to 10 years and everything's still going strong.
And I would say, well, a big thank you to you all to be on this panel today and share your reminiscences and obviously future insights with us. It's certainly great to have you all. So it seems from what I hear, some of you were walking closer to the hardware and feeling the need for some kind of shared software stack. Some of you were working on MQTT already and saw the need for maybe a community around that. But what has been the inflection point where really you all got together and decided to start this thing and start this thing specifically at Eclipse? So what happened?
If I can dive in first, I think initially that there were quite a lot of MQTT client implementations kicking around the place, all downloadable from different places. IBM had some, all sorts of people, had their own little pet implementation, and we needed somewhere to bring that all together so you could go to one place to get your kind of reference client implementations, mainly because vendors were wanting to put that code into commercial applications and commercial devices. And we saw a lot of reinvention of the wheel of people, oh, I've taken the spec and I've reinvented it in C or in whatever your favorite language is, Java or C# even. We said, let's bring that all together. And that was really the beginning of the story. But of course, everything then grew up from there.
Okay, so any other perspective on those beginnings from our two panelists?
I'll add to it. Like so certainly in terms of I think Andy's absolutely right. Kind of need a home for all this technology, but it's also a home for more than just MQTT, because I think everyone viewed that there was going to be a tech stack that needed to have widespread adoption. If you look at, I would often do presentations where you compare kind of the LAMP stack that really propelled the web technology forward, based on open source. And I think the goal, and I think to a large extent, the Eclipse IoT community is achieving this, is kind of providing the equivalent LAMP stack on for IoT. It's a lot more complicated because of the different deployment architectures and different hardware. But I think that's always been the goal in my mind that the team is working towards.
One thing that's interesting as well, and I mean, personally, for me, at least at the beginning, it was kind of frustrating, but it was actually for the best. For the very first few years, the Eclipse M2M/IoT community, we didn't have that much code. It was more about having this forum where the early participants would feel safe collaborating, right, and discussing things that typically they would have thought as being their secret sauce and things they wanted to keep to themselves. But like thanks to the Eclipse Foundation and this notion of working groups, which was, I think, very, very young and very new back then. We for the first few years, I think literally, yes, we had PAHO and like MQTT implementations and so on, but most of the discussions were more on architectures and like what should be the architecture patterns around the MQTT protocol and things like that. And that was that was interesting to see that happen at the beginning.
And I think you are right. If you look, I built at your request, specifically Andy Piper, this timeline of the projects. And that's exactly like you described, Benjamin. There's PAHO and then Cura and Mosquito. And then suddenly something around 2014, 2015 happens there in this community.
Well, interestingly, there were actually a few other projects at the beginning, and some of them are not around anymore. But that's, I mean, that's a really good slide, actually.
I kept only the active projects.
Yes,
for sure.
I think for us, Frédéric, there was an important realization, right? Just as Andy mentioned at the beginning, especially for me, I was coming from the enterprise software world, and software architecture, software framework, the ease of development, the speed at which you could actually develop certain type solution was at a such different level of maturity into the enterprise world than it was into an embedded world. And I think one of the realization there is that beyond open standard for communication from the field to the cloud that was already established as a pattern back then, it was, can we actually improve the whole developer experience for those that are developing at what we would call the edge today, right? Can we bring some of the benefits of enterprise class development, so portability across the architecture, maturity of the tools, rich ecosystem of libraries, of interoperable components, to actually make and ease the pain of those embedded developers that were actually at that point locked into cross compilations for different architecture and microcontroller, right? So if we were intersecting the Moore's law of the evolution of the power that we were getting into new generation of microcontroller, what were coming out as gateways back then, and the state of the software engineering industry, right? We were at the perfect inflection point to actually start promoting that. If we combine that with the big fragmentation that was dominating the industry back then, we also realized that no single company could do that, right? So what better than an open source community could address the fragmentation through collaboration, interoperability tools, and bring the next generation of software engineering tools available to what we called back then the embedded developers.
All right.
I think it was interesting as well, I think, and Ian will keep me honest here, but I think the working group and the projects that made up the working group initially were some of the earlier ones to sort of go beyond the sort of Java base or historical of the Eclipse Foundation projects. And that was really interesting as well. So, you know, I remember back then that, you know, I'd come from IBM and a lot of enterprise Java stuff, but then suddenly we were dealing with sort of embedded C code, which was quite new to the community and the broader spectrum. So I think from the perspective of the foundation, it's had a really good, it's provided a really good opportunity to sort of broaden the scope and enable other projects to find a home in a welcoming open source community that's also really enterprise friendly and benefits companies that are looking for something that's really solid and stable and got good governance.
Yeah, and absolutely, and at the time that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to broaden the potential opportunity of what projects could come into Eclipse, which was historically been very Java centric. And this is where we came up with the working group concept, where kind of it didn't have to be. It was a collaboration. It didn't have to be of individuals and companies. It didn't have to be Java. We weren't rooted in Java. It was really kind of what the group of companies and individuals wanted to collaborate around. This was the starting point.
So in a way, that was not only an important initiative for the machine-to-machine space, now the IoT space, but something transformational for the Eclipse Foundation itself in bringing a different perspective and a different operating model around this. Certainly now, looking at the 10 years of history that we've got here, when you look at everything that has been done, all the projects, all the initiatives, all the events, all the parties, and I missed quite a few of those since I joined later in the process. What's your personal highlight when you look back at those 10 years? So let's maybe start with you, with Andy Stanford-Clark, since you were last introduced.
Hoping to get some thinking time on this one.
Well, if there's a volunteer to jump right away.
So I think really it's been the democratization of Internet of Things. We've seen the growth of cloud platforms for Internet of Things from a number of big vendors. We've seen the growth of commercial broker implementations, and we've seen devices like the Raspberry Pi and Arduino's become totally mainstream. I mean, mainly to their price point and availability, but we've now got school children, people who maybe are heavy-duty software engineers, dabbling with their little computer, making LED flash or something like that, and they're using elements from the Eclipse stack, mostly the MQTT PIO client, admittedly, but the point is that's available to everybody, whereas before it was more as has been mentioned, it was the community and the working groups around the IoT and M2M vendors who were kind of collaborating before we competed in order to get a set of building blocks in place. But for me, it's been that exponential growth of IoT, which has been the highlight, and it's been an extended highlight, I must admit. But in the 20 years of MQTT's history, the first 10 years were very quiet, and then it all went bonkers in the second 10 years. And that's been the 10 years that Eclipse has been around. Maybe a coincidence, maybe not.
All right, so who's next?
So I'll go next. So I think there's a couple of things that I think were highlights. So certainly the success of MQTT, and I'm benefiting from that today, but just to restate it, kind of 10 years ago, very few people have ever heard of MQTT. And it kind of certainly kind of within kind of IBM, kind of within Andy's role, right? Kind of there was some adoption there, but it wasn't kind of an industry thing. I wouldn't claim. Today, it's very much an industry thing. And if you can't, it's really hard to find an IoT platform that does not support MQTT. It's absolutely become the standard for IoT. And I think you can trace back that success to starting the Pi-hole project at Eclipse. And I would also say the Oasis initiative too. But those are two real key points in the inflection of the success of MQTT. And I think Eclipse can take a share of their credit for that. The other highlight, I think, was, and this really kind of point to, I think there's a point of the kind of the education aspect. Early in the process, Benjamin and I, with collaboration from others in the working group, wrote a white paper on the three-stack architecture of IoT. And it's really tried to crystallize kind of how you need to start thinking about software on embedded devices, edge, and the cloud. And the response we got for that was tremendous. And I think it actually really drove some really good thinking in terms of how people view IoT architectures today. And so I'm going to give Benjamin a lot of the credit for that, but I'm going to take some because I'm pretty sure I helped edit it at least. So, but I think that was really an important piece of content that we produced.
Well, do I get to talk about the greenhouse and take the credit for the greenhouse demo? No,
Sure.
to echo your point, I think we've done some education around what is IoT really, and trying to keep things as simple as possible. To me, what's been interesting, maybe more from a personal perspective, especially when I was at the foundation, sort of being the evangelist and the jack of all trades around IoT, was to see, like we've said many times already, MQTT take off, but in parallel, there were things like Raspberry Pi and Arduino. It was pretty much the same time frame. I mean, Arduino was maybe around for a few years already, but Raspberry Pi literally came up when we were already working on these open source stuff, open source building blocks, and it was great to see how the technology eventually we could combine all those building blocks we had started to design, and where we were not necessarily sure how everything would fit together. It actually fit together quite well, so that was cool.
All right, Andy, Marco,
I will take it. Yeah, maybe it's a slightly different angle, but I think it would be as important, right? I think the biggest highlight I got was maybe 3 years back when we were receiving a couple of RFI and RFP from large Global 2000 corporation. You know, you get 200, 300 questions, right? And then all of a sudden you start getting questions that popping in where they're saying, oh, well, open source solution with no lock-in is actually preferred. And sometimes even somebody that's saying, oh, it's required. And that was the biggest highlight for me. I mean, it was great. No, we started as a dream. We collaborated. We put some components out there. Yes, initially we were thinking maybe we're just attracting hobbyists, right? Yes, we are putting open standard, and that was actually exploding. But people recognizing that, you know, software building community, especially the IoT, is a better solution, and putting that as requirements for their productions, right? Commercially solutions. That was, to me, like a proof that, yeah, not only it was a dream, but it was actually getting real, and it was getting the real success that it needed. So, of course, I could mention the highlights of all the EclipseCon conferences and all the fun that we had and the beer and everything else. And definitely I remember the greenhouse demo very well, Benjamin. So congratulations for that. But I think, you know, seeing that in the RFI and RFP as a requirement and as a preferable solution, open source, and, you know, it's Eclipse, right? There's nothing else out there with that level of breadth. That to me was the highlights of this journey.
All right. And finally, for you, Andy.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to rewind all the way back. So what has happened in my career since I moved on from IBM, I spent a few years at VMware and working on Cloud Foundry. I've remained very involved in open source. It's, you know, I'm all in on open source. So, I completely agree with what Marco just said. I think that is something that's been very transformational. It's been an ongoing process in the success of open source over the course of the last 20, 30 years, but really that last sort of 5 to 10 years, it's clear that organizations are really embracing it as the default way of working, which is wonderful to see. What I'm currently doing is I'm in developer relations at Twitter, and I'm not directly related with Internet of Things projects, but I'm also still very involved with open source. And for me, one of the highlights really was when I sort of took a break from the Paho project after about 3 or 4 years, and I was I had this mindset that was like, no, I've got to keep advocating this stuff, because, you know, if we're not continually talking about it, then it will, you know, will vanish. But, you know, we had all of these other folks as part of the community that sort of carried on the conversation and carried on building the community and carried on innovating. I remember, as Andy does very well, and I'm really excited that today is the 12th anniversary of the Mosquito project, when you know, Andy had spoken about MQTT at an event, and then Roger Light had gone away and built a an open source or broker over the weekend and released it as open source code. I mean, that was, and then, you know, over the course of events and time, it joined the Eclipse Foundation as well. So, you know, those kinds of things were just wonderful moments in the evolution and the process and the journey we've been on with this stuff. But I think the thing I'm most excited about, the biggest highlight really, is just looking at the working group collection of projects today, seeing the coverage of different functionality from, you know, above just the protocol layer. You know, you've got data standards, you've got runtimes, and increasingly, I think, and I spoke about this when we when we did the anniversary video for the working group, I'm excited to see where we go next, and I'm sure we'll come on to that, where we start to look at sort of ingestion of data and doing intelligent and useful things. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about as we look back on the last decade.
Yeah,
it's amazing how many of those little events were completely serendipitous as well. I mean, just looking back, you couldn't have planned it. And,
yeah, certainly not. And it grown organically in its own way, like good open source communities do, I think, in the sense that there's no big guiding vision, but rather some guidance, and people jump in as they can. Now, obviously, there's been some highlights, and there are probably things that we could have done better. And as we had a preparatory call for this panel, and that's something that was requested by some of you, discussing a bit, the misses in our history, or the lessons learned that we can learn from as we build the future. So, what are those, in your personal opinion, missed opportunities, or those mistakes that we've made and that we could correct as we go forward as a working group and as a community?
That's a tough one, but
yeah.
Well, it's all perfect, of course.
And I'm not asking for names, but rather, in a general perspective, obviously.
So let's just blame Mike Milinkovich for everything that did happen. Well, so.
Yeah, he's not here. We should blame him. Yeah,
exactly. So,
well, I think to echo what Andy Piper just said regarding PAHO and trying to, PAHO and all things MQTT, like the critical mass was there pretty much from day one, and the community kept growing and organically became like thriving. It's not been the same for all the projects, right? And so whether again, taking my own example, I was both like on the side of running projects when I was at Sierra, and then I was working at the foundation. In both cases, it was sometimes difficult to find the right balance between working just on purely on implementing new stuff and being focused on implementing new features and the community work. And what is the right balance to make sure that the community actually adopts the technology and feels like it's indeed something that's open and that's worth betting on? It's not always easy, right? And some of the projects that are not around anymore on your timeline, Frédéric, might be, and I don't want to pick names, and I don't even maybe remember some of them, but my guess is that some of them are not around anymore because somehow they didn't meet their community, and it's not sure I articulated it this right, but hopefully you guys get the idea.
Well, I don't know whether that's so whether there's more sort of advocacy and evangelism and education that could have been done on the behalf of some of those projects or through some of those projects. I think also, the last decade has seen a huge amount of evolution, and this isn't necessarily things done differently or we could do differently, but I think it will lead to things done differently. Is that the foundation itself has evolved a lot in terms of its tooling. I remember that, as newcomers, some of us at the time as newcomers to setting up a project on the infrastructure, found that, somewhat cumbersome. And
still is up to
absolutely, right. So I think, but at the same time, you've seen the embrace of things like GitHub and other processes and tooling that hopefully enable people to get involved more quickly, and maybe that would feed the kind of things that Benjamin was just talking about, like enabling other developers in the community to get involved with the project more quickly. Again, I know that just sort of playing around this weekend, totally just because I got interested in it with Amlin, the fact that it was already on GitHub, I could just clone it from there and start playing with some of the code using tools I was familiar with, rather than having to go and get it from somewhere else. That was something that felt fairly straightforward to me. So I think those are positive evolutions, and that they could lead to better things in the future. I hope so. So
a lesson learned here is that you have to be where the developers are.
Definitely.
It's much easier that way.
I think one thing that's kind of, as I've noticed, is the advertising and marketing that we've done to get to the right communities. I think we started off talking to the nascent IoT community and what was then the M2M crowd. And I think it was a difficult transition to make ourselves kind of the public facing organization, because very often I had to tell people that, say, where can I get an MQTT client from? Well, Eclipse Paho, of course. And they go, oh, I didn't realize that. Whereas if that has been on everybody's mind, we could potentially have been out there. I think it was selective marketing, selective advertising that we could have potentially got to a wider audience, but maybe that was just a kind of, the market was getting ahead of the way we were doing it. But I think, if anything, being more out there, being more sort of a household name could have helped us.
I think if we look at the 10 years, we had different phases in the evolution of the working group. I think even as an idea, the working group probably has evolved, right? Initially, it was all about adoption and embracing new members and new contributions, right? That caused almost an explosion on the number of projects that we were actually getting in. And then over time, there has been some reconsolidation, maybe some selection, right? But I think one thing, I'll go on, one of the things that has been done recently, thanks to the effort of the newcomers, right? Jens, for example, is one of them, is showing how these components are actually part of a solution, evolving from just one open standard and one project to actually projects that are interoperable among each other. They can actually be composed. The Eclipse IoT packages is a success of that. How can be composed to actually be a bigger building block into your solution, right? So sometimes, community grows a little bit in disorder, a little bit, right, through more and more contributions. Having an active role in putting some order into it, some gardening and some steering, and actually showing how all these pieces are complementary. I think it would, going in the future, simplify people that are getting on board without being overwhelmed, and getting some directions in how to use everything that is available.
That makes sense. All right, so in the interest of time, let's switch gears a bit now. We have lots of collective wisdom on this panel, so I cannot close the discussion without asking you, where do you see things headed? So when you look at the current state of the industry, and specifically IoT and edge computing as a segment, what's next? And I think, well, a few of you, at least in our anniversary video, shared a bit of their vision there, but let's go a bit deeper, and maybe starting with you, Ayan.
Sure. So I think there's kind of many facets kind of what's next. I think things like Sparkplug, kind of having a consistent specification in terms of data payloads is going to be important, and those will be industry specific. So Sparkplug is very much targeting manufacturing, industrial automation. There's one specification for doing, it's called VDA 5050, which is how to control logistics, so kind of autonomous vehicles inside factories. There's another one for ITX-PT, which is doing public transit. So I think we're going to see more and more of these, and these are all done in the open. There needs to be open source implementations of them for sure. But I think this is going to be an important future for it. I think more and more as kind of everything's moving to the cloud. So I think having kind of technology that's cloud native is going to be important, and having sandboxes available to experiment with that technology will be important too. Similarly with the edge computing, I know kind of Eclipse has the edge working group too, which I think is great. And so we're certainly seeing a lot of investment in the cloud side, but also on the edge side. And I think you'll see that accelerating in the next couple of years.
Okay, who's next?
I'll go next. So yeah, I'd agree with that, and I think the big thing we're going to see next, and are starting to see, is fuller interoperability. I mean, we started doing it back in smart city days when we wanted all the different organizations within a city to be able to share data so that the whole became greater than the sum of the parts. But we're now seeing it with technologies like digital twin and factory integration. So things like MQTT Spark Plug, which are bringing together applications at a semantic level rather than just a syntactic level of the MQTT payloads. MQTT gives you the telephone with which you can speak to somebody else. Spark Plug gives you the fact that you can now, the Esperanto, that you can speak the same language. And that's going to be really important as we build more complex systems of systems, and we want to federate both physical systems and the digital analogs of those and digital twins to bring them all together into much more complicated systems. So I think that's going to be the next big thing.
And a fundamental thing in what you just said, Andy, and what you shared, Jan, is this aspect of having those open source specifications that are worked on in the open, instead of just having the ISO, and after 5 years they come to you back and say this is the norm. And if you're not a member of that group and pay to be for the privilege to be a member, then you're late already to the market. So there's a big shift in the way the industry works there, certainly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Maybe I'll go next, right? So I think we mentioned that on the reasons why we got together. Eventually, this was a data integration problem that was a little bit harder to be solved than the typical IT one, right? Data was actually entrapped into devices that were hard to reach or not yet connected, and they had unstable connections to the data center where the data had to be brought. So if you want, maybe the biggest success for IoT would be to just become another transparent enterprise integration technology, right? Not having that problem because it has been established with good enterprise integration patterns, and not having to reinvent the wheel would be our biggest success. And for sure, I think everything is moving in the right direction, right? If we start looking at 5G and faster connectivity into the edge, if we start moving edge AI, right, and edge computing, and be able to massively crunch an enormous amount of data at the edge itself, somebody has to provide that data, and IoT is the best way to do it, right? We'll extract that data. So if if data is the new oil, IoT is the way to extract it and actually feed it into the machine, being at the edge or in the cloud. So I think that would be the biggest path for its success.
Yeah, once you have
like 26 coming up, we should point out that other natural resources are available which don't pollute the atmosphere and don't eventually run out.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, what you guys just said, Andy and Marco, like hopefully when we have figured out how IoT, what makes IoT specific is, yes, the fact that we have devices that may communicate using such or such protocol, but at the end of the day, it's all about the data and all about making that available in good old IT environments. If we get to the point where we really abstract what makes a device, then we can start building like AI models and so on and so forth that are just completely independent on what the physical things that they are operating on, right? And we mentioned smart cities, but like self-driving cars and like smart industry. Yeah, there's tons of applications once you start having a common model and a lingua franca for all the devices.
The thing that excites me the most is the contextual opportunity, right? And we've been talking about this for a long time. Certainly Andy and I have had conversations about this 10 years ago, about like, how, having awareness of information that's useful to you at a particular point in time rather than just all of this sea of information. You're getting to the bits of information, putting them together and doing useful things with them at that moment that they're useful. So what you've all just said, Benjamin in particular was talking about, it's all about the data. Absolutely, yes. But it's also about how and when you use that data. Now you can do that in a batch process, and we're going to carry on doing the batch processing. That's not going to go away. There's still going to be instances where you want to be crunching huge amounts of data in a batch to do something. But I think also there's going to be a great opportunity to build more of those sort of potentially edge solutions that are closer to the user, that are making more use of the stuff that's contextual and useful to the user at a moment in time. And we've been, again, there's books everywhere, every WARE, that's a 15-year-old book or possibly older now, but it's still a great book that talks about, the future of the internet and the Internet of Things as machine to machine, or whatever it was called at the time, bringing those kind of opportunities together. And I think we've sorted, as we've discussed, we've sorted the protocol and we're getting to the data formats. We're still bringing that lingua franca together, that Esperanto, as Andy put it. And we're getting to a point, as we apply big data and machine learning and AI to other problems, that we can start to apply it to these forms of data as well. And it's just, there's so many exciting opportunities here. I don't know what the answer is and which things become the next projects for the Eclipse Foundation, but I do know that it should and can be open source, and we're going to be more powerful working on it together through a transparent, open process.
That makes sense. And I think Mike Milinkovic answered to my question, which is something he shares in the anniversary video that we unveiled today with the rest of our anniversary website, is essentially that at some point we may not need the IoT nomenclature anymore, because when every object is somehow connected, then it becomes a different word. You need a different word to categorize that. So what should be added as our new name as we go forward this brave new word then? Any opinions on that? Probably not. And this highlights how it is difficult, because I was trying to answer myself that question as I was preparing for the panel, and I couldn't come up with an answer that I liked. And so I tested you, put you all on the spot like that, hoping that someone brighter than me would have an idea, and it seems it's not the case. So anyway, we welcome all ideas and contributions there for sure. So we've got roughly we reached roughly the end of this conversation. We wanted to give to the audience the opportunity to interact a bit with you all. So I will simply stop the recording, and maybe if there are people that want to ask you directly questions, we can do just that for a few minutes, if everyone agrees. All right. So thank you, dear pioneers, Marco, Andy, Jan, and Benjamin. Thank you for your contributions in the past, and even your current contributions in the case of some of you, whether you are actively contributing to a project or contributing like Jan to a steering committee, or even in your case, Andy, trying out Emlyn on a whim on a Saturday and confining the code. We really appreciate all of that, and looking forward to see you to see your continued involvement in our ecosystem one way or another. But yeah, a big thank you for everything that you did for Eclipse, for open source. And now I will stop the recording and we go on with the Q&A.